The night they dragged Corvin Ashvale to the border of the Frostlands, the temperature had already dropped low enough to kill a man in 3 hours. He was 16 years old, barefoot on the frozen earth, wearing nothing but the thin training clothes they had left him in because even his pack uniform had been stripped away before the ceremony. The council of the Ashvale clan did not believe in wasting resources on the condemned, and that was exactly what Corvin had become the moment elder. Harwick had stood at the center of the assembly hall and declared, in front of every man, woman, and child in the territory, that the boy standing before them had failed his transformation at the appointed hour, and was therefore, by the ancient laws of their kind, a defective wolf. Not a wolf at all, in truth. Something lesser. Something that had no place within the borders of a functioning pack. Corvin had not cried. He had learned very early in his life that crying in front of the Ashvale clan accomplished nothing except giving the crueler members of the pack more ammunition to use against you, and he had already given them enough over 16 years of quiet, careful survival. He had stood straight while Elder Harwick read the banishment decree. He had stood straight while his father, Aldrin Ashvale, had looked away from the assembly floor and stared at the wall behind the elder's head as though his son were already a ghost. He had stood straight when the 2 senior warriors assigned to escort him had grabbed his arms and marched him out of the hall without ceremony, without a final meal, without even a coat. He had looked for her face before they took him through the doors. He had not been able to find it in the crowd, and later, he would tell himself that was probably a mercy. If he had seen Sarah Voss standing there among the others, watching him be erased from the world they shared, he was not certain he would have been able to keep his composure. And composure was the only thing he had left to take with him into the dark. They walked him to the northern border in silence. One of the warriors, a broad man named Cutter, who had never liked Corvin particularly but had never gone out of his way to torment him either, paused at the boundary stone and looked at the boy for a moment with something that was not quite pity, but was adjacent to it. He opened his mouth as though he might say something, and then closed it again, and stepped back behind the stone line that marked the edge of pack territory. The other warrior said nothing at all. They watched him from the border as Corvin walked forward into the dark, and then they turned and went home, and the Frostlands swallowed him whole. No one in the Ashvale clan expected to hear from Corvin again. The Frostlands were not simply cold. They were a region of active supernatural hostility, a stretch of land hundreds of miles wide where the boundary between the physical world and something older and stranger had thinned over centuries until it was barely a membrane. Things lived there that had no names in the modern pack lexicon. The temperature in the deep interior could drop to levels that would kill an ordinary human in minutes, and would test even a fully shifted wolf to the limit of endurance. The exiles who were sent there from various clans across the northern territories had a survival rate that was, by the informal accounting of those clans, effectively 0. Some lasted a season. A very few had been known to survive their first year. No one, in living memory, had come back. The Frostlands were not a punishment. They were a disposal mechanism with a dramatic backdrop. Sarah Voss was 14 years old the night Corvin was banished, and she stood at the back of the assembly hall, with her hands pressed flat against her thighs so that no one would see them shaking. She had not been able to get close enough to the front to catch his eye. The crowd had been dense, and she was small. A low-ranking Omega girl with no family connections worth mentioning, and the senior pack members had filled the front rows without any thought for those behind them. She had seen the top of Corvin's head moving toward the doors. She had wanted to call out to him. She had not done it, because calling out at an official banishment ceremony was the kind of thing that got your own status reviewed, and Sarah's status was already fragile enough that she did not have room for even a small transgression. She had hated herself for that silence for a very long time. Corvin Ashvale had been, for most of Sarah's childhood, the closest thing she had to a friend in the Ashvale clan. Not a loud, visible friendship, nothing that would draw attention to either of them, but the quiet, sustaining kind that operated in small gestures and shared glances. He had been the one to leave food at the edge of her sleeping quarters during the winter when her mother was sick, and the clan's distribution system had, predictably, given less to the lower-ranked households. He had been the one to stand between her and Mira Coldfen's group without saying anything, just placing himself in the physical space and waiting with the patient, quiet solidity that was his particular brand of courage, until the older girls lost interest and moved on. He had never made a performance of any of it. He had simply been there, in the small, consistent way that mattered infinitely more than grand gestures. And she had understood, even as a child, that this was a rare thing, rarer than strength or rank or the ability to shift on schedule. And then he was gone, and the Frostlands closed behind him, and the clan moved on with the absolute efficiency of a society that had long since decided the cost of maintaining doubt about its own systems was higher than the cost of losing the occasional person to them. Sarah did not move on. She told herself, in the first weeks after the banishment, that the heaviness in her chest was simply grief, the ordinary grief of losing someone you cared about, and that it would ease with time the way grief was supposed to. She waited for it to ease. It did not ease. It settled instead into something quieter and more permanent, a low-frequency ache that she carried with her through the daily routines of her life as an Omega in a mid-tier clan, through the work assignments and the training sessions she was required to attend, even though her shifting ability was unremarkable, and her combat scores were nothing to record, through the seasons turning and the years beginning to stack up without weight or particular distinction. The first solstice after his banishment, she found herself standing at the narrow window of her quarters in the female Omega residential block, holding a stub of candle she had taken from the supply room. She was not entirely sure what she intended to do with it. She only knew that the night of the winter solstice was the longest night of the year, and that somewhere beyond the northern border in the Frostlands, if Corvin was still alive, it would be the darkest night he had ever experienced. She lit the candle and set it on the stone windowsill, and she stood in front of it for a while, watching the small flame push back against the dark, and she did not say anything out loud, because there were no words that seemed adequate to the size of what she felt. She only stayed until the candle burned to the end and went out on its own. She did the same thing the next year, and the year after that. By the fourth year, it had become a ritual so embedded in her private interior life that she no longer questioned why she did it. The other Omegas in her block had noticed by then and made small comments, the kind of comments that were designed to sound like concern, but were in fact a social calibration tool, gentle reminders that she was doing something that the pack's consensus reality had classified as eccentric at best and pathetic at worst. She acknowledged the comments with the same quiet diplomacy she brought to every social interaction that threatened to destabilize her position, and she kept lighting the candle. The pack did not understand, and she did not need them to. By the time Sarah was 20 years old, the Ashvale clan had undergone a significant political realignment. Elder Harwick had died in the third year after Corvin's banishment, and the power structure his death left behind had been reorganized under the authority of Alpha King Darian Ashwood, a man from the southern bloodline who had consolidated 3 clan territories under a single governance framework through a combination of genuine leadership talent and a ruthless willingness to use force when negotiation failed. Darian Ashwood was not, by any objective measure, a bad leader. He had improved supply systems, resolved several long-standing territorial disputes, and established a medical infrastructure that had genuinely improved quality of life for the lower-ranking members of the consolidated territories. He was handsome in a precise, controlled way that seemed almost architectural, as though his face had been designed to communicate authority, rather than emerging organically from his ancestry. He had also, within 8 months of assuming governance of the former Ashvale territory, noticed Sarah Voss. This was not the uncomplicated thing it might have appeared to be from the outside. Sarah was aware that from a social mechanics standpoint, the Alpha King's attention was an elevation of status so significant that it should have resolved every source of anxiety in her life. Other Omegas in her position would have navigated toward that attention with everything they had. Darian was fair to his pack members. He was not known for cruelty in his personal relationships. There was no reasonable argument against accepting what his interest implied. Sarah was polite to him. She was respectful. She attended the functions where her presence was requested, and she performed her pack duties with the consistency and competence that had always been her primary social currency. She simply did not move toward him the way he seemed to expect. And he, being a man who was accustomed to having his expectations met, found this interesting enough to keep his attention on her rather than redirecting it, which created a situation of low-grade social complexity that Sarah managed with careful diplomacy and the same patience she brought to everything else. She was 22 years old, and it was the 6th winter after Corvin's banishment when the Alpha King arrived at the female residential block late on a solstice evening and found her standing at her window with a lit candle on the sill. He stood in the doorway of her room for a moment without announcing himself, taking in the scene with the particular quality of attention he brought to things that did not fit his existing maps of how things worked. Sarah was aware of him immediately, because her senses had been trained over years of low-rank existence to register the presence of anyone with authority the moment they entered her space, but she did not turn around right away. She gave herself 3 more seconds of watching the candle flame before she turned and acknowledged him, and she thought she saw, in those 3 seconds, something shift in his expression. Not quite understanding. Something more like the beginning of a question he had not formulated yet. "What are you doing?" he said, not unkindly, genuinely curious in the way that powerful people sometimes were when they encountered something outside their categories. "Keeping a light," she said. For the solstice, she considered whether the full answer was something she wanted to give him, and decided there was no version of honesty here that was more dangerous than the evasion. "For someone who was sent to the Frostlands," she said, "6 years ago, before your governance began." Darian's expression moved, through several calculations quickly. "Corvin Ashvale," he said, because he had read all the historical records of the territories when he took governance, as thorough men do. "The Defective. He's been dead for years." "Possibly," Sarah said. "Not possibly. The Frostlands are not survivable. You know this." "I know what the clan believes," she said, and turned back to the window. He left after a moment without pressing the point, which was one of the things about Darian Ashwood that made him genuinely a better leader than many of his predecessors. He understood when pushing would cost him more than stepping back, but he carried the image of her at that window with him, Sarah could tell, the same way a person carries a splinter, aware of it at odd moments, not quite able to leave it alone. The 7th winter, the candle on the sill, the same private ritual in the dark, and on the morning after the 7th solstice, the border sentries reported something crossing the northern perimeter, from the direction of the Frostlands. If you are new to this channel, and this is the kind of story that makes you want to pull your blanket tighter and stay exactly where you are, please subscribe now and hit the notification bell, because we tell these stories every week, and you do not want to miss what comes next. Now stay with me, because this is where everything changes. The sentry who filed the initial report was a senior warrior named Breck, a man with 20 years of border experience who had seen everything the Northern Territories had to offer in terms of unusual activity, and had long since developed the professional composure of someone who could not afford to be rattled by his work. His report, which Sarah would later read in full in the administrative record she was given access to as part of the official inquiry, was written in the flat declarative style of a man describing facts that he understood did not cohere with his existing knowledge of what was possible, and had decided the most responsible thing he could do was document them without interpretation, and let someone else deal with the implications. The report stated the following. At dawn on the morning of the winter solstice +1, a large figure had been observed moving south from the Frostlands across the boundary stone line. The figure moved on 2 legs, but with an efficiency and fluidity that was not consistent with normal human or shifted wolf locomotion. Temperature readings in the immediate area around the figure were anomalous, showing localized cold generation that extended approximately 4 meters in all directions from the figure's body. The figure had paused at the boundary stone for approximately 2 minutes, without apparent difficulty in the sub-zero temperature, and then had continued south toward the pack's interior territories at a steady, unhurried pace. The figure had not responded to the standard verbal challenges issued by the sentries, but had also made no aggressive movements. It had simply continued walking. The second thing Breck's report noted was that the figure was large. significantly larger than it should have been based on the bone structure visible under what appeared to be a surface layer of compressed frost that clung to the figure's skin and clothing like a second layer. Not large in the generic sense of a big man. Large in the sense of something that had been rewritten at a cellular level. Bones and muscle reconstituted by a process that left the original person visible underneath, but embedded in a framework that had not existed in them before. The third thing Breck's report noted, in the careful flat tone of a professional who was choosing his words with precision, was that the figure's eyes were the color of pack ice in deep winter, a white so pale it was almost colorless, and that when Breck had looked directly into those eyes from a distance of approximately 15 meters, he had experienced what he described as a temporary cessation of the instinct to challenge. He had simply stood and watched the figure pass. He was filing the report, he noted, as soon as that instinct had returned. The report reached Alpha King Darian Ashwood at the same time it reached the Senior Warrior Council, which was the protocol for border anomalies of significant classification. Darian read it once, and then, according to the account of his adjutant who was present, read it again more slowly before setting it down on his desk, with a particular deliberateness, and requesting that all senior warriors be assembled at the central hall within the hour. Sarah heard about the report through the Omega Communication Network, which operated with a speed and efficiency that the senior warriors would have found unsettling if they had paid more attention to it. The low-ranking members of any hierarchical society develop extraordinary information distribution systems out of the pure necessity of self-preservation, and the Omega block of the consolidated Ashvale territory was no exception. By mid-morning, Sarah knew the basic outline of what the sentries had reported. By early afternoon, she knew the detail about the frost clinging to the figure's skin like a second layer. She sat very still for a long time after she heard that detail. Then she put on her coat and her boots, and she walked toward the northern boundary. She was intercepted before she got halfway there by one of Darian's senior staff, a woman named Alara, who functioned as a kind of diplomatic liaison, and who had, over the 2 years since Darian's attention to Sarah had begun, developed a careful professional relationship with her that was warmer than it strictly needed to be. Alara fell into step beside her without preamble and said quietly, "The Alpha King has asked that pack members stay away from the northern perimeter until the situation has been assessed." "I heard," Sarah said, and did not slow her pace. "Sarah, you can walk with me or you can go back and tell him I'm not responding to the advisory," Sarah said. "Those are the options I have available right now." There was a pause, and then Alara adjusted her own pace to match Sarah's without another word. It was, Sarah thought, one of the more direct expressions of respect she had received in recent memory. The figure was visible from a distance of half a mile in the flat winter terrain, moving with that particular unhurried efficiency that Breck's report had noted. Sarah could see, even from that distance, the frost that clung to him. Could see the way the air around him was visibly different from the air around everything else. A slight shimmer of cold distortion that registered even in the already frigid morning atmosphere of the northern border zone. She could see that he was tall, much taller than she remembered, wider through the shoulders than seemed architecturally possible for a human frame. And she could see the way he moved, the quality of his presence in the landscape, and something in her chest that had been carefully maintained at a low, steady frequency for 7 years, suddenly shifted into a register she had no prior experience with. She started walking faster. The warriors who had positioned themselves in a loose perimeter around the approaching figure noticed her and made the calculation, in that rapid social hierarchical accounting that pack members did unconsciously, that her status vis-a-vis the Alpha King's interest meant that stopping her required a direct order, and the Alpha King had not yet issued one for her specifically. They let her pass. She was 40 feet away when he stopped walking. He stood still for a moment, and then he turned, slowly, toward her, and Sarah got her first direct look at what 8 years in the Frostlands had made of the 16-year-old boy who had left food at her door and stood between her and Mira Coldfin's group without ever once making her feel like a burden for needing the protection. The bones were his. The structure of his face was unmistakably his, the same architecture she had carried in her memory for 7 years, like a pressed flower in a book, flattened but intact. But everything else had been rebuilt. He was at least a full head taller than any man in the pack. And the width of him was something her eyes needed a moment to process correctly, because it didn't match what her brain expected from a human standing at that distance. The frost was real. A thin, permanent layer of compressed ice crystals that covered his skin and the surface of his clothing, not obscuring him, but inhabiting him in the way frost inhabits an old window, part of the surface rather than something laid on top of it. His eyes were exactly as Breck had described, the palest possible color, barely distinguishable from white. And when they found her face, they focused with an attention so complete and so still that everything in Sarah that had been tightly managed for 7 years went completely quiet. "Sarah," he said. His voice was lower than she remembered and carried a resonance that she felt in her sternum, rather than just hearing with her ears. A quality of depth that had not been in it when he was 16, and that she understood now was not simply the ordinary change of a boy's voice becoming a man's voice. It was something else. Something that came from whatever he had been fused with in the deep interior of the Frostlands. "You're alive," she said, and her own voice surprised her with its steadiness. "You lit the candle," he said. Not a question. Every year, every solstice, something moved in those pale eyes. She could not have named what it was. It was vast, and it was not cold despite everything the cold had done to him, and it looked at her with a recognition so complete that she had the vertiginous sensation of being seen by something that had been holding her face in its memory, the same way she had been holding his. "I felt it," he said. "Every year. In the dark. 7 candles." Sarah breathed. 8, she said. "Tonight will be 8. Behind her, at a distance she registered but did not turn to assess. She was aware of the senior warriors holding their perimeter. She was aware of the sound of additional movement that suggested the Alpha King himself had arrived. She did not turn around. Corvin's gaze moved over her shoulder briefly, taking in whatever was assembled behind her, and she saw the frost on his skin shift slightly, the ice crystals, realigning in a ripple pattern that moved outward from his chest, and the temperature dropped another several degrees in the immediate area around them. Not aggressively. It was simply what he was now, this weather system he carried inside himself. Then he looked back at her, and the quality of his attention resettled into that complete, still focus, and the temperature stopped dropping. "Are you all right?" he asked, and the specificity of the question, not "are things well," or "are you safe," in the general sense, but the particular direct inquiry about her specifically, landed in the center of her chest with a precision she had not been prepared for. "Better now," she said honestly. "Please take a second to like this video if you're feeling this story the way I think you are. Because Corvin Ashfell came back for one reason, and her name is Sarah Voss, and we are just getting started. Keep watching." The formal confrontation between Corvin Ashfell and Alpha King Darian Ashwood took place in the Central Hall of the Consolidated Territories Administrative Center, and it was witnessed by the full senior council, every available warrior of significant rank, and a number of lower-ranking pack members who had positioned themselves in the surrounding areas in that organic way that pack communities gathered for events of sufficient historical weight. The news that a Frostlands exile had returned, and that he had returned as something that even the border sentries had declined to. Challenge had moved through the territory with the speed of the Omega communication network and the weight of something none of them had a prior category for. Sarah had been asked, firmly, but not unkindly, to wait in the corridor outside the hall's main chamber. She had declined this suggestion and entered the chamber, and no one had formally ejected her because, again, her status vis-a-vis the Alpha King's attention created an ambiguity in the authority structure that none of the junior staff wanted to resolve without direct instruction. She stood against the wall near the entrance with Alara beside her and watched. Corvin stood at the center of the chamber floor, with the particular stillness of someone who had spent 8 years in an environment where unnecessary movement cost energy you might not have. The frost had settled into something quieter in the warmth of the interior space, not disappearing, but diminishing to a fine shimmer that covered his skin and gave him the appearance of something caught between states of matter. He had not been given a seat, which was a deliberate positioning choice on the council's part, and he had not asked for one, which suggested he understood the dynamic and had decided it was not worth addressing. Darian Ashwood sat at the head of the council table with the composed authority of a man who had spent his adult life making difficult situations navigate toward outcomes he had predetermined. He looked at Corvin with the same assessing attention he brought to every significant variable in his governance. And Sarah, watching from the wall, saw something in Darian's face that she had not seen there before. Not fear. Darian was not, she suspected, a man who experienced fear in the conventional sense, but something adjacent to recalibration. The quality of a chess player who has just had a piece appear on the board that is not in the standard set. Corvin Ashvale, Darian said. You were banished from this territory by lawful decree 8 years ago, by Elder Harwick's decree, Corvin said. His voice in the enclosed chamber carried that resonance fully, and she saw several of the council members shift in their seats without appearing to consciously recognize why. Under laws that defined my value by whether I could perform a transformation on a schedule imposed by a system that had decided in advance what I was. Those laws are the foundation of pack governance. Some of them, Corvin said. Others were written by men like Elder Harwick, who benefited from a narrow definition of acceptable and used the authority of tradition to make that definition permanent. He said it without heat, evenly, as though these were simply accurate descriptions of historical fact that did not require emotional decoration. I'm not here to contest the banishment. I'm here because I chose to return. You have no standing in this territory. I have the standing of what I am, Corvin said. You're welcome to contest it. The challenge was not delivered as a taunt. It was delivered as a statement of available options, the way you might describe 2 roads at a fork to someone who had asked which way to go. Sarah watched Darian process it, and watched him arrive, with the efficiency of a truly capable leader, at the accurate assessment of his position. The warriors in the room were well-trained and numerous. Corvin was one person, but the temperature in the chamber had dropped 5 degrees in the 4 minutes since. Corvin had entered it, and the frost on his skin was not a cosmetic quality, and there was something in the way the senior warriors were holding themselves that Sarah recognized from her long observation of pack body language as the specific posture of people who were present at something that exceeded their current operational parameters. What do you want? Darian said. To live here, Corvin said. Among my people, by which I mean the people I was born among, and the people I am choosing to return to. I want a place in this territory. I'm not asking for rank or authority. I'm asking for the recognition of my right to exist within my own community. A pause. And the Omega, Darian said, with the directness of a man who preferred to name the variables rather than let them operate under the table. Sarah Voss. Corvin's pale eyes moved briefly to Sarah's position against the wall, and then back to Darian. The frost rippled outward from his chest again, very slightly. What about her? He said. And the evenness in his voice had acquired a quality that was not quite a warning, and not quite the beginning of weather, but was somewhere in the neighborhood of both. My interest in her has been a matter of record in this territory for 2 years. I'm aware, Corvin said. Sarah will make whatever choice she makes. I haven't come here to make her choices for her. He paused. But I've come back in part because of her. That is also a matter of record now. The silence in the chamber was the kind that has specific weight. Sarah felt it on her skin. Darian looked at Corvin for a long, assessing moment. Then he looked at Sarah across the room, with an expression that was not wounded, because Darian Ashwood was not the kind of man whose ego operated at that frequency, but that held something more honest than she had expected from him, an acknowledgement of something, a recognition of a variable in the equation that he had not weighted correctly. Then he looked back at Corvin and said carefully, the Frostlands transformation. The ancient texts call it the hybrid Arctic fusion. It was believed extinct. The texts were wrong about what could survive it, Corvin said. They were right about what it produces. You're more powerful than anything in this territory, Darian said. It was a statement of fact, not a complaint. Yes. And you want a room in the residential block and the right to walk the territory without challenge. Approximately, Corvin said. Another long silence. And then Darian Ashwood, Alpha King of the Consolidated Northern Territories, who had never in his adult life been in a room where his authority was the second most significant force present, said, "The banishment decree will be formally rescinded. You'll need to submit to a council assessment of your current nature for the purpose of governance records. And we will need to have a broader conversation about the implications of your return for territorial law regarding Frostlands. Exiles. That conversation was overdue regardless of my return," Corvin said. Agreed, Darian said, and something in his expression suggested that this agreement was genuine, which raised him slightly in Sarah's estimation. Welcome back to the territory, Corvin Ashvale. The council session broke apart with the barely contained energy of a room full of people who needed to go process what they had just witnessed and did not yet have the private space to do so. Senior warriors moved in, clusters, speaking in low voices. Council members gathered their papers and their composure in roughly equal measure. Ilara put a hand briefly on Sarah's arm, a gesture of something that was solidarity adjacent, and then moved off to fulfill her professional obligations. Sarah remained against the wall. Corvin crossed the chamber floor toward her with that quality of movement that she had noticed from 40 feet away in the winter landscape. That unhurried efficiency that was its own kind of presence. He stopped a few feet from her, and up close the frost was real, and the height was real, and the pale eyes were real, but also the particular quality of attention he had always had. The way he had always looked at her as though she were specifically visible to him in a way she was not always visible to others. That was also real, and had survived everything. "You walked out to meet me," he said, when the warriors were holding the perimeter. "Yes," she said. Why? She thought about it. Not because she didn't know, but because she wanted to give him the accurate version. "Because the perimeter was between me and you," she said. "And I have spent 7 years waiting for a reason to cross it." He looked at her for a long moment, with those pale eyes that had seen 8 winters of the kind of darkness that would have ended most things. Then he said, 8, quietly, and she felt the word in the same place she had felt his voice in the chamber, in the center of her chest where the frequency of it was exactly right. 8, she agreed. "For those of you who want to leave a comment before we go further, I want to hear from you right now. What did you feel when Corvin said he could feel her candle in the dark for 7 years? Tell me in the comments. Let's keep going." In the weeks that followed Corvin's return, the Consolidated Northern Territory underwent the kind of sustained low-grade seismic shift that occurs in any established social system when a variable appears, that the system was not designed to accommodate. The formal processes moved with reasonable speed. Darian Ashwood was efficient in his governance, and the council assessment of Corvin's current nature, while unprecedented in its subject matter, was completed within 10 days by a team that included 2 scholars of supernatural biology who had been brought in from the Southern Archives and who produced a report that was, by academic standards, barely able to contain its own excitement. The hybrid. Arctic fusion had not been documented in living practice in over 3,000 years. The 2 scholars spent the better part of their assessment session asking Corvin questions that were more research interview than governance necessity, and Corvin answered them with the patient directness he brought to everything, though Sarah, who attended the formal portions of the session, noticed that he redirected several questions about the more extreme limits of his new nature with a particular economy, of words that suggested he had made conscious decisions about what he was willing to document. The banishment decree was rescinded at a formal council session on the 12th day after his return. Elder Harwick was 8 years dead and could not be held directly accountable for what had been done under his authority, but the council did something that Sarah had not anticipated. They included in the formal rescission language an acknowledgement that the criteria used to determine Corvin's banishment had been incorrectly applied, that the failure of transformation at the standard age was not, under the original foundation laws of pack governance, actually a banishable offense, and that the decree had been issued using Elder Harwick's personal interpretation of law, rather than the law itself. This distinction was technically narrow but politically significant, and it was the first formal acknowledgement in the territory's modern governance history that the Banishment Council's previous actions had been subject to individual interpretation rather than objective application. It was not, as Corvin said to Sarah quietly after the session, sufficient. But it was a beginning. Sarah had been given, through a housing allocation request that Alara had processed with notable efficiency and no editorializing, a room in the general residential quarters that was an upgrade from the Omega Block in terms of space and access. The Omega Block itself was a remnant of the previous administration's stratification structures. And there was, in the weeks following Corvin's return, a series of council discussions about the governance framework around rank-based residential segregation that had not been happening before his return, and that were happening now in the specific way that things begin to happen when the existing structure is confronted with its own illegitimacy by something it cannot dismiss. Corvin had been given quarters in the northern residential section, by his own preference, near the territory boundary, and he spent his days in what appeared from the outside to be a process of patient reintegration. He attended the territorial governance meetings when the agenda was relevant. He spoke when he had something to add, and did not speak when he did not. He performed the physical labor that any non-ranked member of the territory contributed, and did so with the same undemonstrative efficiency that characterized everything he did, except that when Corvin Ashvale lifted a beam or shifted a supply load, the quantities involved were somewhat different from those achievable by anyone else in the territory, a fact that the workers around him adapted to, with the practical flexibility of people who needed the work done, and were not particularly invested in the mechanics of how it was happening. He and Sarah fell into the rhythm of each other's presence, the way rivers fall into their beds, not with drama, but with the complete inevitability of water and gravity. She brought him food on the third day, because he was still acclimating to the territory's supply systems, and she knew those systems in the way that people who have navigated them from a disadvantaged position for years know them, completely and without illusion. He accepted it with the directness that had always been one of his most disarming qualities. No performance of gratitude, no deflection, simply, thank you. And then the food eaten with the focused economy of someone who had spent 8 years not taking a meal for granted. They talked in the evenings, sitting outside his quarters where he preferred to be because the indoor temperature of the building was something he was still calibrating his body to tolerate. He ran warm now in a paradoxical way. The cold he generated was an outward expression of something that burned internally, rather than evidence of his own temperature dropping. He told her about the Frostlands in pieces, not in a way that was managed or selective, but in the way that people tell the truth about difficult things, when they have found someone they are certain will receive it correctly. The first winter, which had been almost entirely about survival, at a level so elemental that it had stripped away everything except the most basic versions of himself. The second winter, which had been different, when he had gone deep enough into the Frostlands to find the place the old texts apparently called the crystalline core, and what had happened there was something he described with the careful precision of someone documenting an experience for which the vocabulary barely existed. It didn't ask permission, he said, on an evening in the second week, sitting on the frozen ground outside his quarters, with his back against the building wall, and the stars very clear and cold overhead. The fusion. It didn't ask if I wanted it, but it also didn't take anything from me that was mine. It added to what was there, and what was already there was enough to build from. What do you mean? Sarah said. The Frostlands have killed every other exile because the people who were sent there had already been broken by the banishment before they arrived, by what the pact did to their sense of themselves before they were sent through the boundary. He paused. I wasn't broken. I was angry, and I was in grief, and I was cold, but I hadn't been made to believe I deserved what was done to me. I knew it was wrong. Sarah looked at him, because of what I meant. To you, she said. Not a question, not a declaration, just the careful placing of an observation to see if it was accurate. He looked at her with those pale eyes that held 8 winters of darkness and the light of 7 candles. Because of everything you were to me before I left, he said. You were the evidence that the world contained something worth returning to, even if I never got back. That doesn't break a person. It anchors them. She put her hand on his arm, over the frost on the sleeve of his jacket, and felt the cold of it through her palm, and the deep, steady warmth under that, the internal burn that was the fusion made permanent in his bones. And she stayed there with her hand on his arm, until the cold no longer registered as cold, only as part of the particular weather that was Corvin. If you are watching this at midnight because you couldn't stop, please leave a comment that just says the candle, and I will know exactly who you are. This story is not done yet. Keep watching. Darian Ashwood came to find Sarah on the 15th day after Corvin's return, in the early morning before the territory's daily activities had fully begun, and she received him in the small sitting room, adjacent to her new quarters, with the attentiveness that the situation required. He sat across from her without the official trappings of his role. No council members present, no adjutant hovering at the door, and he looked at her with the clear-eyed directness that she had always considered one of his genuinely admirable qualities. "I want to tell you something," he said, "that I think you probably already know, but that I would like to say directly because I believe in the value of saying things directly." "All right," Sarah said. "My interest in you over the past 2 years has been genuine," he said, "and I am not in the habit of withdrawing things that are genuine simply because the circumstances make them complicated." A pause. "But I am also a man who understands the difference between something that has been chosen and something that has been settled for. And I would rather you choose clearly, whatever it is you are going to choose, than arrive somewhere by default, because the social structure of this territory made it difficult to choose otherwise." Sarah looked at him for a moment. "That is a remarkably fair thing to say," she told him. "I am occasionally a remarkably fair person," he said, with the brief wry quality that appeared in him sometimes and that she found unexpectedly endearing. "Corvin Ashvale came back from the Frostlands for you. 8 years in conditions that should have been unsurvivable. And he came back for a candle that you lit on his behalf every winter solstice." He paused again. "I have done a great many things in my life that I am proud of. I have not yet done anything equivalent to surviving 8 winters in the Frostlands." He stood. "I wanted you to know that I see clearly what is in front of you, and that the governance of this territory is not going to create obstacles for whatever you decide." He left without ceremony, and Sarah sat for a moment with the particular quality of feeling that comes from being treated with more generosity than you necessarily expected, and she thought that Darian Ashwood was, as she had always suspected, not a bad man. He was a man who had not met his equivalent yet, and who conducted himself with integrity in the interim, and she hoped sincerely that he would find his equivalent eventually, because she thought he deserved to know what that felt like. Then she put on her coat and went to find Corvin. He was at the northern boundary, as she had half expected, standing at the edge of the territory's border zone in the early morning cold with that quality of attention that he gave to the landscape of the Frostlands, not longing and not dread, but something more like the particular relationship you develop with a place that has remade you. She came to stand beside him, and they looked north together at the flat, white expanse for a while without speaking. "Darian came to see me this morning," she said. "I know," Corvin said. "I could smell him on the territory path. I assume the conversation went well. He gave me more grace than he was required to," she said. "He's a better person than the situation needed him to be." "I know that too," Corvin said, without resentment, which was itself a measure of something about who he was. "He's a good leader. He's governed well here." "Yes," Sarah said, a silence that was full, rather than empty, the kind that exists between people who have enough shared history that silence does not require filling. "I need to tell you something," Sarah said, "and I want to say it directly because I have spent 8 years finding indirect ways to feel things, and I am tired of that particular discipline." She turned to look at him, his profile against the winter sky, the frost on his skin and the impossible breadth of him, and the pale eyes that turned from the north to meet hers, with that complete, still focus. "I lit the candle because I could not light it. I lit it every year because the alternative was accepting that you were gone, and I was not able to do that. Not because of what I hoped would happen. I did not spend 8 years hoping you would come back. I spent 8 years refusing to let you be gone. Do you understand the difference? Yes, he said quietly. And now you are here. And you are not who you were when you left. And I am not who I was when you left. And I don't know yet what we are to each other now, except that you said you could feel my candle in the dark. And I believe that completely. And I want to know all the rest of it. She held his gaze. All the rest of what we are. Whatever that turns out to be. I want to know it. Corvin turned fully toward her, and the frost on his skin caught the morning light and scattered it in small cold sparks, and he raised one hand and put it against her face with a gentleness that was entirely at odds with the scale of him, the same quality of careful attention he had always brought to everything that mattered to him. I came back for you, he said, not to claim you, not to declare anything. I came back because you kept a light on for me, and because I had spent 8 years with your face in my memory, and I needed to know if the person you had become was as worth knowing as the person I remembered. He paused. She is. You are more worth knowing than anything I imagined in the dark. She put her hand over his against her own face, and felt the cold and the warmth beneath it. Then let's go find out, she said. And there in the flat, white winter morning at the edge of the world, with the frostlands at their backs and the territory spreading south before them, and 8 years of impossible distance finally closed, they began. The formal changes to pack law began in the spring, which was appropriate because spring in the Northern Territories was the season when things that had been frozen became possible again. The initiative that restructured the governance framework around transformation standards and banishment criteria was not credited to Corvin, because Corvin had been explicit about not wanting his name attached to it in a way that would make it seem like a personal agenda rather than a structural correction. It was sponsored by Darian Ashwood, which was strategically sound, since Darian's authority gave the reforms the weight they needed to pass without extended resistance from the conservative faction of the council. And Darian's willingness to sponsor them was a measure of the intellectual honesty that Sarah had noted in him from the beginning. The reforms were not small. They addressed not only the transformation standards, but the entire framework of rank-based resource distribution that had created the conditions for Sarah's childhood, and for countless others like her. The Omega residential segregation was formally dissolved. The distribution system was restructured to operate on need-based principles, rather than rank-based ones for essential resources. The banishment criteria were rewritten to require evidence of actual harm to the community, rather than evidence of deviation from standard physical norms. It was not a revolution, because revolutions tend to produce the same structural problems they displace once the immediate energy dissipates. It was a correction, systematic and unglamorous, of specific mechanisms that had been causing specific harm for a specific period of time. It would need to be maintained, and Corvin said so at the council session where it was ratified, clearly and without apology, that the work of governance was not the moment of change, but the decade of maintenance that followed it, and that anyone who thought otherwise was going to be disappointed. Sarah, sitting in the council chamber as an invited citizen observer, which was itself a change, saw several council members nodding who had not expected to find themselves in agreement with an 8-year Frostlands exile, and who had the slightly disoriented expression of people discovering that their categories need updating. The summer was long and unexpectedly warm even by the northern standards, and Sarah spent much of it in the state of quiet, sustained contentment that comes to people who have been patient for a long time and have been vindicated not by dramatic reversal, but by the slow, faithful accumulation of things going right. Corvin's integration into the territory continued at its unhurried pace. He did not seek authority, but authority found him in the organic way it finds people whose judgment is reliable and whose presence is stabilizing, and by midsummer he had become, without title or formal appointment, the person that the northern border zone's residents went to when they needed something resolved. This suited him. He was constitutionally suited to exactly this: the quiet, effective application of his particular capabilities to the specific problems in front of him. And he operated this way with a satisfaction that Sarah recognized as the satisfaction of someone doing exactly what they are built for. They built their life together in the same way, without drama and without the kind of performed significance that people sometimes impose on things to make them feel proportionate to the effort it took to get there. They cooked in the evenings in the kitchen of the quarters they had formerly shared since late spring. They walked the territory perimeter together in the early mornings, which was both a habit of Corvin's and a governance function, since his assessment of any unusual activity in the border zone was more accurate than any sensor system the Council had ever installed. Sarah continued her work in the territory's newly restructured resource distribution office, where she had accepted a position that had been offered to her with a specificity that acknowledged her particular expertise in navigating the system's previous failures, which was a bureaucratic way of recognizing that the people who had been most damaged by a broken system usually understood it most completely. They did not perform their relationship for the territory. It was simply present, visible in the ordinary daily evidence of two people who had organized their lives around each other, and the territory, for the most part, observed this with the slightly odd quality that people bring to things they recognize as significant without being able to fully articulate why. On the 8th winter solstice after Corvin's return, which was the 16th winter solstice since his banishment, Sarah placed a candle on the windowsill of their quarters. She did it in the early evening, as the solstice dark was coming down, and Corvin came to stand behind her as she lit it, putting his hands on her shoulders with the easy, certain quality of someone who has found the place in the world where his hands are correctly positioned. "You don't have to anymore," he said. "I'm here." "I know," she said. That's why. He understood this, as he understood most of what she said, immediately, and without needing it explained. The candle was not for the dark anymore. The candle was for the light that had always been its purpose. The acknowledgement that some things are worth keeping a light for, not because the darkness threatens them, but because the light itself is how you honor what survived it. They stood together at the window until the candle burned down, and the frost on his skin scattered the candlelight in small cold sparks. And outside the territory spread south in all its complicated living ordinary wonder, and the frostlands lay quiet at the northern border, and between them, in the room that held the last of the candle's light, there was nothing left to wait for, and everything left to have. Epilogue. 3 years later. The spring council session that ratified the final phase of the governance reforms was attended by representatives from 4 neighboring territories who had, over the 3 years since the initial restructuring, been in formal dialogue with the consolidated Northern Territory about adopting compatible frameworks in their own governance structures. This was not an empire. Darian Ashwood was emphatic about this in the language of every formal agreement he signed, and Corvin, who attended the session in the capacity of the informal but acknowledged role he had developed as the territory's primary liaison for boundary-related and supernatural category governance questions, supported this framing completely. What they were building was a network of compatible systems, not a single system with a center, and the distinction mattered. The session ran long, as governance sessions do, and in the late afternoon, Sarah left the observers' gallery and went to collect their daughter from the territory's Child Development Center, a program that had been established in the second year of the reforms as part of the resource restructuring, and that had become one of the most widely supported governance initiatives in recent memory because the argument for communal investment in children's developmental needs turned out to be remarkably easy to make once you removed the rank-based framework that had previously determined whose children's needs were worth investing in. Their daughter was 3 years old and was called Lyra, which Sarah had chosen because she had always loved the word, and because there was something in its shape that felt like the particular combination of precision and warmth that she wanted to plant at the beginning of a person's story. Lyra had her father's eyes, the pale, clear color that on a 3-year-old produced the slightly uncanny effect of a child who appeared to be seeing more than was strictly developmentally appropriate. She did not have the frost, and the scholars had confirmed she would not. The hybrid Arctic fusion was not inheritable. It was a transformation specific to the conditions of the frostlands and the individual who encountered them. What Lyra had was her own, and they were still in the early stages of finding out what that was. She ran to Sarah at the door of the center and announced that she had made a bird out of clay that Sarah needed to come see immediately, because it was the best bird ever made, and waiting was not an option. Sarah went immediately to see the bird, which was a credible bird by any standard, and genuinely excellent by the standard of a 3-year-old who had been working with clay for about 6 weeks. She said so honestly, because she was constitutionally opposed to the kind of parental dishonesty that children see through instantly, and that teaches them nothing useful about the difference between effort and quality. "It's a very good bird," she told Lyra. "The wings are particularly good." "I know," Lyra said, with the absolute serene certainty of a person who has not yet learned to doubt her own judgment, which Sarah intended to defend for as long as humanly possible. Corvin was waiting for them at the path outside the center, having extracted himself from the session's final procedural stages, with the practiced efficiency of a man who had identified exactly the moment at which his presence was no longer necessary. He swung Lyra up when she ran at him and held her against his shoulder with one arm, and she told him about the bird immediately with the same certainty she had brought to Sarah. And he listened to every word of it with the specific quality of attention that was his particular gift. The ability to give his full focus to whatever was in front of him as though the size of a thing was not a relevant consideration. "I want to see the bird," he said. "We're going back tomorrow," Lyra told him. Mama said. "Then tomorrow," he said, and looked over Lyra's head at Sarah with those pale eyes, and she looked back at him in the spring late afternoon light, with their daughter between them, and 3 years of built life behind them, and however many years were ahead of them, and felt, in the way she had felt everything significant in her life, quietly and completely, and without the need for it to be larger than it was. "How was the session?" she said. "Long," he said. "Productive. Darian handled the neighboring territory representatives well." "He usually does." "He does," Corvin agreed. There was nothing in his voice when he said Darian's name except accurate assessment, which was the same thing that was in Darian's voice when he said Corvin's name, and which was one of the things Sarah had come to see as evidence that both of them were, in different ways, exactly who she had understood them to be. They walked home through the spring territory, Corvin carrying Lyra, who was explaining the bird's wing structure in technical detail that was ambitious for a 3-year-old, and that both of them listened to completely, because there was nothing else they needed to be doing, and nowhere else they were required to be. And the evening was long, and the light was good, and the path was familiar underfoot, and everything that had once seemed like it might be permanently out of reach was simply, ordinarily, completely theirs. On the windowsill of their quarters, a small candle waited for the solstice, still months away, already placed. If you made it to the end of this story, I want you to know that you just heard something about the kind of love that does not ask to be seen. It just keeps its light on anyway. If this story moved you, please subscribe to this channel, hit the like button, and leave a comment telling me your favorite moment. Was it the frost, the candle, the way he said 8? Tell me everything. And come back next week, because we have another story waiting that is going to find you exactly where this one left you. See you then!